First, we have William Gibson, who has been teaching a variety of history and social studies courses at Madison East High School for over 20 years, including World History, AP European History, Modern Latin America and the Caribbean, and US and Contemporary Affairs. We also have Sarah Motl, as a social studies teacher in her 17th year at Madison East High School. She teaches World History and Sociology. And Sarah earned her undergraduate degree at Augsburg University and her master's in educational psychology at UW Madison. Welcome.
Hi, everybody.
Greetings, folks.
So I'm Sarah.
I'm Bill.
We're sitting in my classroom.
We're friends. We've been sitting here for hours trying to make each other not nervous. So all we're doing is make each other nervous.
Yeah.
So we're doing the best we can.
Bill, I'm nervous. Me too. So hi, everybody. This has been a really powerful weekend, and Bill and I are here to just talk a little bit about how we teach about genocide here at East High School. When we met the other day, Mary mentioned to us that some questions teachers had asked in advance were like, how do you teach this stuff without traumatizing students? And so I guess what I'm going to talk a little bit about is just kind of more generally, like how, not that I have all the answers to that, because I don't, but how I try to deal with that. And then like kind of just a couple examples of how I teach about genocide. So, because, like a couple of speakers have mentioned, it would be ideal to have lots of time to talk extensively about all sorts of things. And, like in a class, like we teach world history, like what the hell does that even mean? So you don't have a lot of time. So I'll just talk about a couple different ways that I actually do teach about it. But I thought a lot about what Mary said, like how do we teach about genocide, which is really traumatizing, without traumatizing our students. I know that I work really hard to try to remember that a lot of my students are 15 and like what that actually means about how they think about the world and experience things, and like remind myself that the way they perceive the material we're covering is going to be different than the way I do now at my age. So a lot of times what I do is I try to remember how I felt in high school learning about difficult things, because like people at work will tease me about movies and stuff, and they'll be like, yeah, it's not rated, Sarah, you shouldn't watch it, because I'm a big baby about everything. And so I think about like how I felt in high school when I learned about really hard things, because it was really hard for me. And I was the kid that got traumatized in class when I learned about hard things. So part of what I do is just try to think about that and like think about how I'm going to frame it. So one specific thing that I try to do, whether it's in my world history class or my sociology class, is I try to be really clear about why we are talking about it. Like, I am not here telling you about all these horrible things that happen just to make you upset. Like, I'm not doing it just to make you cry or just to make you have nightmares later on. Like there's a purpose, right? There's an actual purpose for why we are learning about these things. So I'll give an example of that in a minute, but I also try to give them like breaks as we're learning about something that's really hard, time to like process with each other, even if it's just like doodling on a piece of paper, because they just need a break from thinking about these really hard things. So like specifically, like I saw it on a slide, Bill has it on one of his slides. One of the things that, a phrase that we always hear when we talk about specifically like the Holocaust is never again, right? So when I talk about these things with my students and I'm trying to explain to them why it's important that we're learning about it, because like we can't actually have never again if we don't know what happened in the first place. And this is, I think, where our social studies classes really, really matter, like in a very relevant, specific way. Like sometimes kids will be like, why am I learning about this stuff that happened 400 years ago? Like, why does it matter? And it's like, well, here, this is why it matters, because how are we going to prevent atrocities in the future if we don't understand the historical context where they've happened before, if we don't understand how human society works, how human behavior works. Like if we don't know that stuff, it's just gonna repeat itself, right? So for example, one of the classes that Bill and I both teach is world history, and we teach it pretty differently, actually. Like I teach it more chronologically, kind of all over the world, jumping around, whereas Bill will stay like in an area and do more of like an area studies kind of thing. But one of the things that, I teach about is imperialism. And so when I teach about imperialism, we talk about not just like what that means and different examples of it, but like how that had, consequences that were intended, but it also had unintended consequences. So like broadly, like it's important for me to first my students to understand that like government actions have unintended consequences. And if we have an understanding of that in the past, we can kind of maybe see where they might happen in the future. So when we talk about imperialism in South Africa, that's when I usually bring up the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. So like it's not a specific genocide unit, right? It's not a specific unit about Rwanda even. It's about imperialism and one of its consequences. So I take them through, right? Like the Belgians showed up and the Belgians saw these different ethnic groups and they were the ones that said, oh, well, this group is superior to this group. And I mean, you all, we heard really powerful stuff about that topic yesterday. So I mean, I don't have to get into the details, but so we look at how the Belgian government, without obviously intending to create a genocide, I mean, in some ways laid the foundation for that. So in a world history class, I think it's, you can, cover that topic by looking at consequences of government actions. Another class I teach is sociology. And when Bill initially asked me, like, when do you teach about genocide? I thought about my world history class, but then I was like, oh wait, I think I talk about it like at least twice in Soc. So it's just an example of how world history is a required class in Madison. So, our students are going to learn about genocide through that class. Sociology is an elective, but I talk about genocide. The first time I talk about it in Soc is when we're talking about human behavior, and we talk about like how conformity and obedience works in society. And we talk about a really famous experiment, the Stanley Milgram experiment, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. If you haven't, Stanley Milgram did this experiment in 1960, I think. It was in the 60s. And he designed this experiment where there was a teacher and a learner, and then like the experimenter was in the room with them. And the setup was that the two people in the room, one was supposed to give the other person like a list of word pairs, and if they got the word pair wrong, then they were shocked. And they were told that it was an experiment about memory and punishment, but the real purpose for Stanley Milgram was to see if the person delivering the shocks would actually deliver the shocks. Like that was the whole point of the experiment. It had nothing to do with memory. The learner actually never got shocked. That was just a setup. And the whole point of the experiment for Stanley Milgram was to try to understand how the Holocaust could have happened. And yeah, obedience to authority. Thank you for adding that. So he was, so the whole point for him was how could so many people have participated in the Holocaust? Because I know, so this is something Bill will talk about too, and other people have mentioned. it wasn't just concentration camps. It was like all sorts of regular everyday people allowing it to happen, and all these little steps along the way. And he, you know, Milgram was like, oh, I bet like Germans are like more obedient than other cultures. Like that was his hypothesis. So his idea was, I'm going to do this experiment here in the United States, where he thought people would be like, forget that. I'm not shocking that person. That's crazy. I'm not going to do that. And then he'd go to Germany and do the same experiment and find that people were way more obedient. But what he actually found is that people in the US were like, oh, a guy in a white lab coat said that I should shock this person. Okay, zap. And it was horrifying for him, right? Because most people actually went all the way and like delivered really, well, thought they were delivering really powerful shocks. So in my social class, we talk about that experiment to look at like, this is how it happens, right? I mean, like people, you know, so we talk about obedience and authority and when do we obey and how do we feel comfortable? Like, how can we get ourselves to feel comfortable not obeying authority figures when it's something that is betraying our conscience? And so I think it's important to talk about those things in our classes, because if students aren't asked to think about it, then if they are presented with a situation where they're asked to do something or go along with something or be a bystander of something, if they haven't already thought about the idea of being a bystander or the idea of conformity and obedience, they're, you know, going to be less likely to push back and fight against it. So I guess just in summary, right? Like for me, it's important to, when we're dealing with these like really scary, violent, traumatic topics that we do talk about, whether it's genocide or something else, because there are other upsetting things that we talk about in history classes too, it's important to me that students understand the purpose of it. Like, this is why we're doing it. And it doesn't necessarily make it feel any better to learn those things, but at least they know there's a point to it. And then they, you know, will go along with it and get something out of it, hopefully. Let me share your slides.
Sure, hey, thank you, sir. All right, greetings, folks. Happy Sunday, January 16th, 2022. Thank you, Mary McCoy, for inviting us. This privilege to participate. It's always a wonderful opportunity to work with UW, with my friends, Mary and others up there, Nellie, my former student, Eleanor, I'm sorry. Yeah, so I'm just gonna briefly talk about how I teach about the Holocaust and then some resources. So what you're seeing here is the screenshot of a torchlight parade in Nazi Germany, sometimes in the 1930s. So I show this as a starting point when I introduce the Holocaust and genocide to impress upon the students the imperative of teaching about genocide. So we have this, and then to make it much closer to home, right, we have an image from Charlottesville in August 2017, right? Other neo-Nazis in a torchlight parade. And they're essentially, go ahead. Yeah, so it's you know, it's alarming, right, that it's certainly making the Holocaust and anti-Semitism much less abstract, showing these images, because this is, in a sense, making this imperative more like an emergency, right? So these people are not far away. They're not, it's not a black and white image, right? These people are amongst us, right? And they're very, very dangerous. So, so I see my role as a genocide educator, as a preventer, right? To teach the kids to try to prevent genocides and make them aware of how real this stuff can happen rather than abstract. It's also frightening that these people are not just amongst us, right? But that the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville and those brown shirts in the first image were yelling the same thing: blood and soil, right? Or in German, Blut und Böden. And so I use this also as a starting point to get a grip on the Holocaust. which is very, very complicated, as all the commentators have been talking about. All these genocides are multi-layered, very, very complicated, and very, very difficult to teach about. But this is just one way to do this. So this blood and soil idea, right? Hitler's war aims in the East, this idea of Lebensraum, getting living room for the Germans, right? And with their invasion, especially Poland, but especially the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, because that's when we see the Holocaust really ramp up into its extermination phase, right? As the previous presenter was talking about, it was just recent, Nazi policy in 1938 was a policy of expulsion of Germany's Jews. And then it transforms into a policy of extermination with the conquest of Poland and the Soviet Union, right? So this idea, Hitler was very, very concerned about food insecurity, the nightmare of November 1918, when World War I ended. This is what the Nazis were going to just try to make sure never happened again, right? That they were going to colonize the East, and they were going to use the breadbasket of the Ukraine to feed the German people. What they were going to do with the people in the East was enslave them or exterminate them, especially the Jewish population. And Hitler's model for his this vision, right, did not come from something from European history. It came from American history with westward expansion. So you can see the westward expansion here on the left. So again, bring in this education closer to home. Okay. So I teach 3 case studies in, I teach, like Sarah says, with Sarah, world history, but then I teach these electives that allows me to do more fleshed out case studies of genocide. So I do World War II and the Holocaust in AP European history and world history. I do the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in both another class, another elective I teach, and also in world history. And then I also teach a class on modern Latin America and the Caribbean. And I do a case study on one of the most least known genocides that people, in people's consciousness, and that's the genocide against the Maya population in Guatemala during the early 1980s. So you see images here, a children's drawing, right? The trauma that they went through, these things that they saw, mass graves. And then you can see the main perpetrator, Reyes Montt, Efrain Reyes Montt, pictured here with Ronald Reagan. So while he was carrying out the genocide, right, he was a close ally of the United States because he was a Cold Warrior, right? He was an anti-communist. So again, bringing these things closer to home. To start off with the teaching, I start with more abstract concept formation. And so I asked the kids these questions, right, as a way of not going right to the details of genocide. So the 2 questions I'm really focusing on at the outset is, what is genocide and how does genocide differ from other acts of mass violence, especially ethnic cleansing, which is pretty close to the conceptual borders of genocide. And then the second one is, what is the state's role in instigating and carrying out a genocide, right? The state is the only institution that has the capacity to carry out a genocide effectively. And what is the state's role in preventing a genocide? So, which is a difficult question. So via the first question, what is genocide? It gives me an opportunity to examine the convention, the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So here it is, and I think maybe it was Professor Hinton yesterday who said that the genocide, this is kind of purposefully ambiguous. And Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide, would have liked to have seen more categories, right, of victims besides in Article 2, right, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So we just flush this out and then talk about the weakness of it. I also say this is the core of international law. And if this is not abided by, then international law is essentially out the window, right, so to speak. So the importance of protecting this convention as the core of international law. The other one, the role of the state, the other question is a way for me, for example, to talk about like how, the Nazi Empire was huge. You can see it, the images under German control at the height of their empire in November 1942. And so this helps me like make comparisons between the fate of Jews in two northern European countries. I used Denmark and Estonia, right? Both countries on the Baltic. And Denmark, very few Jews were killed, and in Estonia, essentially all of them were killed. And what happened is that yes, the Germans did conquer, right? They did occupy Denmark, but they did not destroy the state. They did not destroy the Danish state. And so the rules that were in place before the Nazis arrived were still in effect, right, when they were occupying. And so there was lots of resistance to what the Germans wanted to do, was to deport the Jews from Denmark to Auschwitz. But in Estonia, the state had been destroyed twice. First by the Soviets, when they marched in, after the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, and then again by the Nazis when they invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, right? So in places where the state was destroyed, especially the places where the state was destroyed twice, first by the Soviets and then by the Nazis, right? In that area of Eastern Poland and the Western, especially, right? This was the area where the bulk of the death camps were situated. So I try to help the kids make some sense of that. I do talk about Auschwitz, Auschwitz-Birkenau, the primary killing center in our consciousness. But I read a book a few years ago by a scholar, Timothy Snyder, called Black Earth, and I was really impressed. It was very impressionable, this paragraph that Sarah will read to you. It's pretty scary stuff.
Auschwitz has become the standard shorthand of the Holocaust because when treated in a certain mythical and reductive way, it seems to separate the mass murder of Jews from human choices and actions. Insofar as the Holocaust is limited to Auschwitz, the gates and walls of Auschwitz can seem to contain an evil that in fact extended from Paris to Smolensk. Auschwitz, a German word defining a bit of territory that before and after the war was in Poland, does not seem like an actual place. It is surrounded by mental as well as physical barbed wire. Auschwitz calls to mind mechanized killing or ruthless bureaucracy, or the march of modernity, or even the endpoint of enlightenment. This makes the murder of children, women, and men seem like an inhuman process in which forces larger than human were entirely responsible. When the mass murder of Jews is limited to an exceptional place and treated as the result of impersonal procedures, then we need not confront the fact that people, not very different from us, murdered other people not very different from us at close quarters. In the history of the Holocaust, Auschwitz was a place where the third technique of mass killing was developed, third in chronological order, and also third in significance. The most important technique because it came first, because it killed the most Jews, and because it demonstrated that a final solution by mass killing was possible, was shooting over pits. The next most important and the next to be developed was asphyxiation by the exhaust fumes of internal combustion engines. At around the time that these carbon monoxide facilities were coming into use in early 1942, the policy of murdering all Jews was extended from the occupied Soviet Union and occupied Poland to all lands that fell under German control. Auschwitz became the major killing site for Jews in 1943 and 1944.
Thank you, sir. So this is my way of, rather than emphasizing specific places, my education about genocide has really been more, I guess, been influenced because of reading books like this to talk more about, instead of places, to talk more about participation, okay? And this is like, incredibly horrific, right? And I'm very nervous when I teach about this stuff, the death pit murders. But for me, this is the way to help. Well, it doesn't help anything. It's just a way to make some sense of this evolution from a policy of expulsion to extermination, which for me, I think is an important thing to teach. Again, there was, in Auschwitz, there were relatively few SS. There was an infrastructure of destruction, but this one was massive, right? This was massive. It wasn't located in one place. There were tens of thousands of German soldiers used by the Einsatzgruppen, the guy on the left, you can see, the killing squads, tens and tens and tens of thousands of soldiers that were stealing off the shtetls, right, for the Einsatzgruppen to do the destruction, right? And so there was lots and lots of witnesses, and also hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, right, seeing this go down. So this is the part of the Holocaust which really shows lots and lots of participation. I do the same thing. Oh, are they going? Sorry.
There you go.
So the next one, in terms of participation, is when I teach about Rwanda, right? Again, so this was a genocide that unfolded over about 100 days in the spring and summer of 1994, where perhaps 500,000 to 800,000 people were killed. And so this is a, I tried to focus on this question of mass participation, again, getting at this problem, right, that I italicized here, right? Then we need not confront the fact that people not very different from us murdered other people not very different from us at close quarters. So that's resonated with me ever since, well, for a very long time. But. So a couple of resources that have influenced my thinking about this and my teaching about this is Scott Strauss's, who was used to teacher until recently at UW Madison, The Order of Genocide. He did a lot of field work in Rwanda, interviewing perpetrators in prison and asking them what was the motivation, right, to participate. And again, there were tens of thousands of Rwandans who did this. And then these two books on the right, Ordinary Men, which has been around for a number of decades by Christopher Browning, is an excellent resource. And then more recently, Black Earth by Timothy Snyder, The Holocaust as History and Warning. Also another resource, I teach a class on modern Latin America, and the professor had shown us some resources to teach about that period of Argentine history, which is just an unbelievable nightmare. But I highly suggest this video on this film on the left called Cautiva, if you wanted to explore more about Argentina. Okay, so the professor had talked about that a number, about 500 children. Their parents, when they were young, were detained. So you can see here on, this is the, above here.
This one?
Yeah, so this is a memorial in Buenos Aires. There's the Naval Mechanics School, which is one of the principal torture and killing centers during these events. And this is a memorial showing that, pregnant women who were detained they allowed the baby to come to term while they were under detention. The babies were born, and then the mothers were killed. And then the babies were essentially trafficked amongst police and military families. And so this was a huge issue in Argentina in the 1990s and 2000s about who are these children, who are their parents. So again, memory, victim is, I'm sorry, it's just Argentina is, the professor had mentioned that, Argentina is still overcoming these events that happened in the late 70s and early 1980s. Sometimes in April was also mentioned, this is a film about the Rwandan genocide by Raoul Peck. It came out in 2004 on the 10th anniversary of the genocide. There are sections, I do not recommend showing the whole movie. It's pretty graphic, but there are sections in here that help, that can help with teaching about the origins of the Rwandan genocide. So, and then the last one I want to show you is this thing from the Choices program. Can you click on that? Open it up. And so Choices, Brown University has these Choices program. Many of you might know about this, but it has a very good curriculum set that you can purchase that's both digital and in print that my students find very, very useful. So, all right, folks, that's what I got for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. So Kristine Johnson is currently an English language arts teacher at Racine Unified School District and has taught middle school English and history for the majority of her 24 years of teaching in urban districts. She earned her 2 undergraduate degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Lakeland University, and her master's degree in educational leadership from Northcentral University in San Diego, California. Welcome.
Thank you. And I'm just going to go right into it. I'll tell you a little bit about myself, but you already mentioned it. This year I'm teaching 5th grade, and I do know that 5th grade could fall under Act 30. And so it's definitely a more touchy situation. We don't necessarily go into the images, and we have to be very careful about our vocabulary that we're using because they don't really understand. So my perspective is also very literature based. Even when I taught history for all those years, I always incorporated literature. So I also talk about the risk in this presentation. So because I encounter with the younger ages, you will encounter the risk of not just the school board, but the parents. And it depends, it does depend where you teach. I know Madison has a different perspective, just from living here for 5 years, I know that, but I also know that other smaller districts that I have taught in, and even just in a different place, even the urban districts, it matters. Parents respond a little bit differently. So here's my slideshow. I'm going to get started with that. Okay, can you guys see it? Yeah, okay, yes. Thank you. So initially I titled it Never Again, Yet Again, because I've been to Washington, D.C. many times. I've taken classes to Washington, D.C. many times, actually. I'm going again as a chaperone and the lead teacher with World Strides to take my students there again to see the Holocaust Museum. And Never Again is where I learned about this expression from that Holocaust Museum in DC. But yet again, we have more genocides since World War II. So, but then I changed it because I didn't know how that would resonate necessarily with other people. I usually incorporate, just like I'm sure all teachers do, I incorporate music, I incorporate art, I incorporate literature, I incorporate everything I can to get a child to understand, because we know about the different intelligences of children. Some people will remember something because they remember the music. Some people remember the art. It's important to touch on all of those things to me. I'm not going to go ahead and show this, play this for you because in the interest of time, but this is a song by Stephen Melzak, and he is a Jewish songwriter, and it is called Never Again, and it's a beautiful song. So if you want to, write that one down, it's a good one, to touch on the feeling of, and the try to grasp the gravity of 6 million people. So here we go. I'm going to skip that song. I'm going to skip the song. Sorry, I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay. So this is a quote that I remember in high school. My history teacher, my junior, senior year, had this quote on the board. And I know the other teachers were just talking about this in a very real way. I'm just going to name him George Santayana. So this is about history repeating itself. I remember walking in the very first day of my history class in high school, and my teacher had, Mr. Wazalowski was his name. He had this quote on the board, and he said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it," by the philosopher George Santayana. And I put this on my board for my students, even my 5th graders, because we talk about how history has repeated itself and how it's our job to somehow prevent the atrocities from happening again. Oops. This number is difficult for 5th and 6th graders, 7th and 8th graders. For me, for you guys, this number is impossible to understand, especially for 5th and 6th graders. So while I try to get, I try to show them this number because, children, especially the younger kids, they love statistics. They think, oh my goodness. They don't have a sense of it. They can't think of 6 million M&Ms, much less 6 million people. They don't understand it. They look at the 30 kids in my classroom and they know that we can't move because there's no room, but they can't imagine what 6 million is. Then the definition, the intentional, systematic, state-sponsored murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children during the Holocaust. The younger kids, we have to be careful about these words: systematic, intentional. Intentional, we can explain. Systematic, we can explain. State sponsored, they don't understand state. They're going to think Wisconsin, they're going to think Illinois. Those kinds of things we have to try to explain if we're going to use the words. If we're not, if our kids can't understand those words, they're not at that level. And remember, I teach in an urban area and in Racine, and I taught in Milwaukee for a very long time. Our children aren't having those conversations at the dinner table with their parents. So their vocabulary is lacking what might be in a private school or might be in, you know, a different city. And so keep that in mind. And I've taught in those other schools as well. There's a big difference. So we want to just make sure we know our, and you know your kids, of course you do. So just remember that's vocabulary is important. So the objectives, obviously Act 30, we're all, you know, compelled as the social studies teacher to teach this now. We always did. We were always teaching it. A good conscientious teacher has always taught these things, hopefully. And people said to me, why do we need a law? And I said, you know what? By Governor Evers signing Act 30 last April, we now have an extra layer of support. It's because yes, we've taught the Holocaust. Yes, we taught about the Indian Removal Act of 1830. We've done this. But at times we're criticized for the way we teach it. At times we're criticized for how long we teach it or how long we don't teach it. We're criticized. Ladies and gentlemen, we're criticized. And now we just have this, the mandate underscores responsibility and provides us with an element of protection for teachers. So I do appreciate that that's there. And I appreciate also that it goes down to 5th grade because some of our kids are ready to learn. They ask these questions. I have to answer them. That's my responsibility. So, but there's a risk, and I'll tell you about that risk in a little bit. The other objectives, share with your administrator, send a letter home if you want. I did this when I was teaching in a district that was an urban district, but not Milwaukee and not, it was a suburban district. And I taught there for quite a while. And I sent a letter home. I said, this is what we're going to be talking about. Immediately, I got responses from parents. And immediately they said, we don't believe in this. And those were their words. We don't believe in this. I was teaching, we were reading Malala's book. And so I had to have this discussion with the parents. I called them and I said, let's meet, let's talk. I'll get my administrator. I said, what do you not believe in? This is a 15-year-old child that was shot in the head by the Taliban for going to school. What is it about it that you don't believe in? Well, it's not our religion. Okay. So then I had to have this discussion. In the end, that child had a different assignment. That child sat in my classroom, did a different but related assignment while everyone else was learning this. That child wasn't happy to be singled out either by their parents. And that child continued to learn what was going on in my classroom. She had the option to go somewhere else. But the parents said, no, that's okay. She could stay there. But she was very interested in Malala's story too. So she, you know, by way of being in that classroom, she still learned. As she could have been out, but they said, no, it's okay. So she also learned about the other assignment that I gave her. So in the end, it worked out, but there is backlash. I even then wanted to take my class to go see Malala because this was at the time that the movie had just recently come out. And because of that experience, my administrator was extremely hesitant. At first she said no. I had to put together a list of reasons, a proposal of why it would have been valuable. And it was. And I took them, and Marcus was wonderful. They gave us $2 movies with, you know, free popcorn, and then we got our bus, and it was fantastic. And the kids remember. You face different things in different districts. So teaching about genocide, teaching about empathy. At 5th grade, what I start with is empathy. We teach it character education anyway, but empathy is key. That is absolutely key. They have to be able to understand what empathy is in order to be able to really learn from these lessons. Preview the vocabulary, use maps, read fiction books because that's what the kids really like, but also read nonfiction accounts. Read those or watch those videos, those videos of interviews. Read the nonfictional interviews that were done by survivors. Discuss ways to recognize discrimination. And then talk, listen to them, debrief them. These children are young. They aren't going to understand everything. And they are going to try to make those comparisons. When I think it was Alana, I'm not sure who it was, but said, don't make comparisons, make connections. Yes, because these young children want to compare. They want to say, which was worse? It's always like, it's kind of like a would you rather. And it's like, oh my goodness, no, this isn't time for that. So we have to talk about that. I have a Dropbox. I can't get to all their questions, put it in the Dropbox. I will put it on, the next morning meeting, the answer that I have, if I have an answer. So teach empathy, teach about listening. At this age, the children want to think about and formulate their next comment. In 5th grade, they comment a lot. They don't always ask questions. In 6th and 7th grade, they start to ask questions. But those children are not necessarily listening to your answer and not necessarily listening to their student's question. They're thinking about what they can say. So try to remind them, we're thinking, we're listening, we're paying attention to other people here. And that's really important is in our discussions. Give them a map. Our children, my kids, my 5th graders in Racine, they still ask me, is Racine a state? Is it a city? What is the state? They'll say, they don't understand. They're still, and remember now with COVID, and you guys know this, my children were already behind. Now they're functioning at almost like a 3rd grade, what you would expect at 3rd grade, and they're 5th graders. So give them a map, point it out, put little symbols on it to show what you're talking about that particular day. Make sure that they can see that here's where you are in Madison, and this is Wisconsin, and then here's the United States. Now over this ocean is where you see Europe. Okay, so make sure that they have this available to them. And if you don't have a map like me in my classroom, then you provide that map for them, give them that physical piece, or have them open up their Google. It's right there. They've all got computers at this point. And remember that our youngest children depend on that picture in their minds. You're creating that picture for them. My kids, when they're playing basketball on the playground, they forget that there's a grass area right next to them. They forget that there's a street over there. They see what's in front of them. You have to mentally create images for them. And then they're smart. They can do it once you give it to them, once you remind them. They're not incapable. They just need you to point them in the right direction. And then it helps them, that's all. So reading for me really transforms somebody who's just standing there passively learning into somebody who can take action, somebody who can help. If you teach them about bullying and you teach them about genocide, they can then they can recognize elements of it, and then they can stop it, or they can report it, and you can help. But reading with young kids, don't hand them that book and walk away. You have to read with them. I believe, I'm sorry if I don't mean to be like lecturing, but I believe you need to read the book with them so that you can be there for their questions, so that you can explain the vocabulary, so that you can highlight any misconceptions that somebody might have. Giving a book to a 5th grader, even like the book that I love to teach, and I just taught again this summer, Number the Stars, that someone mentioned earlier. The book takes place in Denmark, which I know Bill had mentioned. And this story, it's all about how a friend helps a friend who is Jewish. So a non-Jewish girl helps her friend who's Jewish, and they're able to help them escape when the rabbi announces to the synagogue that, I've been warned and we need to go. And so they're able to get away. It's a book of resistance. The children won't understand that story and all its implications without you. Most of them won't. And they'll miss so much without you. So be there for them. Don't just assign the books to me. That's my opinion. Another book that I use is Snow Treasure. So Snow Treasure is a book about the resistance in Norway. And these are young children's books. These aren't the heavy stuff, really. This is how the children get on sled, and this is fiction, just like Number the Stars. They get on sleds and they actually take all the gold bullion and they relocate it to a boat. And I don't remember specifically because it's been a couple of years, but I think they blow the boat up in the end. I don't remember, but or maybe they take it away. I don't remember, but it is really a phenomenal book for children just to start the conversation. You don't get all of the the hard stuff that they teach in high school and college. You don't get all of the images, you don't get all of the brutal mass murder and things like that. It starts the conversation and it touches on it. And that's where we have to start in 5th and 6th grade. These are some books that, you know, that are, some of them are more appropriate for high school. Some of them have been banned, shocker, right? But they have, and the reason they've been banned by certain districts is because they might use the word ass in it. And a couple of them do, that one of the graphic novels does. They might have something that, you know, is sexual in the book. So not all of these are appropriate for 5th and 6th grade. Like I said, I kind of stick to those other ones. And then I also like teach books like, I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget, like Walk Two Moons to teach about empathy, or I teach books like Esperanza Rising, things like that, where they can learn about people who have to leave their homeland because of certain, you know, whatever despots that have come into play or whatever in the government. I teach about those kinds of things to start the conversation for the 7th and 8th grade and high school teachers to then have those bigger, heavier conversations about genocide. I use artwork. This is called Smoke. The children in my grade won't have the first clue. If they've read something like Devil's Arithmetic, they will understand this. If they've looked on the internet, which by the second that I've allowed them to open their Chromebooks and we start talking about these things, they've already seen images and pictures that like Bill was showing and stuff. My kids have seen it because they automatically go to those things. They want to know, they're thirsting for knowledge. So they've seen those images, but this smoke at the first, they're not going to know what this is. It starts that discussion. It starts that conversation for them in a less difficult way of seeing the the bodies of the people who have been killed. But unfortunately, it is going to conjure up the images of what took place. And this is kind of where I want to wrap up a little bit. Teaching involves risk. At this age, parents are very protective of their children still. And those children are talking to their parents, especially if it's something interesting that they've learned at school. So they're talking to their parents. They're not going home and, quickly getting through their homework and then going to McDonald's to work and then, hanging out with their friends at night. These are younger children. So their parents are going to send me a class dojo saying, what on earth did you just say to my child today? Or they're going to call the preferred way is just to go right to the principal. They go right to the principal and complain. And it's difficult for a teacher to take that criticism. It's always difficult. It never gets easier. I question myself all the time. Should I have, should I not have? I do. And sometimes I have to take my licks for it. And I just say, I'm sorry. I will rethink how I approach it next time. I do my best. And you just do your best. Just think about the age, talk to other teachers, find out what has worked. Talk to your administrator. If you have, like I have in the past, had some administrators that are very hesitant, I want to say, about teaching these things, just try to educate them and get them to have confidence in you and that you're going to do what you think is best, and that hopefully what you think is best is best and it's appropriate for the children. Because this is important. And another thing that I learned at the museum in DC is what we do matters. What we do matters. And that's not on just a daily thing if we stand up to bullies, but it is what we do in that classroom, whether we teach something or we choose not to teach something. It matters. I just want to wrap it up by saying have courage and good luck. And for everything that you guys do, everything, every day, it hasn't been easy. It never is, but COVID added an extra layer of difficult for us. Stay safe and good luck to you guys. And thank you for everything you do.